America's biopharmaceutical companies have one very important thing in common:
a common enemy.
We're making great progress because we're collaborating in ways that we've never done before.
In a matter of weeks, we've progressed from potential treatments
to antibodies and antivirals that have shown positive results.
to several promising vaccine candidates.
Because science
is how we get back to normal.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our inaugural Bloomberg Prognosis event, how COVID-19 is actually reshaping the global healthcare ecosystem. My name is Francine Lacqua, and I'm joining you this morning from Bloomberg's European headquarters in London. Now, today's conversation, as you've guessed it, will focus on COVID-19, the pandemic, and how it will reshape our healthcare systems. In this global emergency in which the coronavirus continues its inexorable spread with disproportionate impact on communities of color, the urgent search for effective therapeutics and, of course, vaccines has led to unprecedented collaborations between healthcare and drug companies, academic researchers, nonprofits, and governments. Even so, some stresses to this collaborative approach are fairly evident, such as governments eager to secure first treatments, but also potential vaccines for their domestic populations. In today's event, we'll try and explore some of these critical issues. So we'll ask, what is a realistic timeline for an effective vaccine? Do we have the global manufacturing capacity to create enough doses to create meaningful immunity? And of course, who should get the vaccine first and who decides that? We'll also be getting into many of these issues in a special issue of Bloomberg Businessweek magazine, which is online today and on newsstands tomorrow. So welcome to our viewers from across the US and Europe. If at any point you encounter some technical difficulties, a simple refresh of your browser should help to get things back on track. You also have the opportunity to participate in the live poll a little bit later in the program, so be on the lookout for that. We also say hello to the thousands of listeners tuning into social media and via live streams on Bloomberg.com and on the Bloomberg terminal. I'd also like to thank our sponsor of this event, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, or PhRMA, which represents America's leading biopharmaceutical research companies for their support in making today's event possible. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce PhRMA's President and Chief Executive, he's Stephen Uber.
Thanks for the opportunity to be with you today. It's my pleasure to report on the progress our companies are making against the fight against COVID-19. Our companies are rallying in 4 key areas to address this public health crisis. The first is enhancing our nation's testing capacity. One of our largest members, Roche Diagnostics, is now processing more than 1 million tests a day. What you might not be aware of is that our companies have their own laboratory testing capability. So one of our members, for example, Eli Lilly, opened their own drive-through testing center, which is processing thousands of tests a day and supplementing the Indiana public health authorities. Our companies are also studying their existing medicines. There are now over 1,400 clinical trials governing 120 products. You've no doubt heard about Gilead's remdesivir being approved, but there are other studies of immunologic agents aimed at slowing the body's or stopping the body's inflammatory response that invades the lungs, as well as anticoagulants, among other promising areas of study. 2 of the most exciting developments in terms of developing new medicines are focused on monoclonal antibodies, taking the antibodies from individuals who have recovered from COVID-19 through their plasma and enriching that plasma and using it in other patients, but also bioengineering antibodies that are shown to, again, neutralize the virus. They can be used to both prevent infection as well as treat those that are already infected. And of course, our companies are focused on developing a vaccine. There are now over 150 programs underway, which is really important that we have that many shots on goal, because not all those vaccines are going to be proven safe and effective. And the human body responds variably to vaccines. So it's really important that we have that diversity of clinical trial activity. I think our companies are positioned to succeed and rise up to meet this challenge for 3 key reasons. The first is the reason the companies have been able to move so quickly is that they're really leaning on their previous experience with similar diseases, whether it's Gilead and their deep knowledge around hepatitis C, HIV, other viral diseases, or other companies that have deep experience in SARS and MERS and other similar diseases. That deep scientific knowledge is enabling the companies to move swiftly. The companies have also invested in key technologies in recent years that have enabled the companies to decode the virus in record time. You may be aware that during the SARS epidemic, it took nearly 2 years for the first vaccine candidates to make their way into human trials. And here we are with COVID-19, where literally it was only a couple of months after the first diagnosed cases that we already have clinical trial candidates in human trials. The other key factor, I think, is that our companies are uniquely positioned to manufacture and disseminate at scale when we do have a safe and effective therapeutic or vaccine. And I should point out that the companies are already manufacturing, even though they don't know if FDA is going to be able to approve their products, so that if they do, we're able to move product to patients as quickly as possible. I want to say a word about affordability. Our industry is keenly aware of the environment that we're operating in, and it's deeply committed to working with governments and health plans to ensure, again, when there are safe and effective therapeutics and a vaccine, that they are broadly available to patients as quickly as possible. But I think there's a broader point to be made about what an industry, a vibrant biopharmaceutical sector, is capable of doing, and ensuring that we have this innovation ecosystem that we continue to nurture, which is the envy of the world. And unfortunately, we've seen a number of public policy proposals put forward in recent months that we think would take us in the wrong direction. If you think about the government setting the price, we already know how that movie ends. If you look at markets where the government determines what medicines are worth, they tend to have less access to the latest treatment innovations. They have worse outcomes. If you look at the UK, for example, and some of their cancer outcomes, they more resemble Eastern Europe than they do the 5-year survival rates in the United States. And it tends to depress R&D investment. It wasn't that long ago that the epicenter of the industry was in Europe. There was actually in the mid-'80s about 24% more research conducted in Europe than the US. Today, it's 40% more in the US than Europe. And a key contributing factor to that were the steps that European governments took to set prices and limit access. So we think there's a better way. We think it's a false choice to pit innovation against affordability and access. And we're very focused on policies that will help solve the problem, that will lower costs for patients at the pharmacy counter. So whether it's capping out-of-pocket costs in the Medicare program, allowing seniors to spread those costs over a calendar year so they don't have sticker shock in January before they meet their deductible, or taking other steps like sharing the rebates and discounts that our companies provide to health plans and PBMs to pharmacies, to patients at the pharmacy counter. So thank you again for the opportunity to be with you today, and look forward to the discussion ahead.
Well, let's start by introducing our first speaker. Joining us today is one of the most high-profile and influential chief executives of the moment. He's Vassant Narasimhan, the chief executive of Novartis, one of the world's largest medicine producers, and he's been chief executive since 2018. Vas, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. Now, you're a vaccinologist. You've worked with the WHO in the past. You're now in charge at Novartis. Should we have seen this pandemic coming?
You know, Francine, when you look at the history of pandemics, we see these events happen periodically over every few decades. I think we know that if we have very strong surveillance of the hotspots where we see viruses jump from animals into humans, if we have good communication systems, and if we have good pandemic preparedness, we can at least understand that something is emerging. So I think we could have done better for sure. And we see this after each and every pandemic that has happened over the last few decades. I think the world has to dedicate itself to really monitoring these locations and rapidly disseminating information, and then ensuring we have enough preparedness to rapidly develop countermeasures like we'll talk about, drugs and vaccines.
So what were the early mistakes? Did we not take it seriously enough? And how will that help us in the next?
Yeah, I think a few big learnings. One, I think we have to assume that in the current age of globally connected economies and rapid and the amount of travel that's happening around the world, that even what seems like a very self-contained outbreak could rapidly become global, as we saw what happened from Wuhan to around the world. So I think there was a tendency to underestimate this virus probably in the initial days and overestimate the ability to contain it. So I think that has to be a really critical learning. And then I think the other big learning has to be we have to maintain warm preparedness. We can't scale up medical countermeasures and the medical systems to be ready overnight. We need that warm preparedness to be ready for future outbreaks.
We'll talk about therapies and vaccinations in a second, but what do we actually understand about the virus? It's only been, 6-7 months since we started studying it.
I think it's been remarkable, first, the amount of scientific effort that has gone around the world. It's unprecedented. We have, as we'll discuss, thousands of clinical trials, hundreds of drugs and vaccines in development, tens of thousands of publications. So I think the amount of characterization that's happened of this virus is quite remarkable relative to anything that I certainly have seen in recent memory. We clearly understand the basic biology of the virus. We're understanding more and more about how it infects the lungs and ultimately how it leads to some of the sequelae that happen in patients. We're understanding more and more about the epidemiology and transmission. But there are important questions we don't understand. We don't exactly understand what gives you protection to the virus. We don't exactly understand why some people get very ill and many people have no symptoms at all. So many open questions we still need to solve.
Do we know about antibodies? So do they definitely fade? And if they fade, how much more difficult is it going to be to find a vaccine that
This
works?
is one of the toughest questions. In vaccines, we are often looking for what's called a correlate of protection. This is where we understand how does the antibody response in the body relate to the ability to clear an infection. We usually develop this over running large-scale studies over many years, which we don't have the luxury of doing right now. So we're having to make a lot of assumptions as to which antibodies are going to lead to protection and for how long. The truth is we won't know until we follow patients in the clinical trials, particularly in vaccine clinical trials, out for 6 months or a year. The things we'll hope to understand very quickly is, are the antibodies providing near-term protection? How long does that protection last? And are we getting what's called immune memory? So is there an ability in the body to mount another response if the virus were to reemerge in the future? Or do we need booster vaccinations like we do every year with influenza vaccines?
So given what you've just said, are you comfortable and confident that we can eradicate, this virus through vaccines, or do we just need to learn to live with it?
When I think about how coronaviruses and similar viruses have evolved within human populations, we of course live with more than at least two coronaviruses today, which cause the common cold, and these circulate seasonally all around the world. I think what's realistic to expect is that with a combination of drugs and vaccines, we can get to a stable place where the pandemic is manageable, and then over time there'll be hopefully enough immunity built up in populations that this becomes like those other viruses. Eradicating a virus like this is quite challenging, and I think unlikely. We don't know for sure, maybe, but unlikely. But unlikely.
Vass, what was your thought process? So we first, learn about the virus in China, in Wuhan, and then it spreads. What do you think, Novartis' contribution in this pandemic can be? Why go into treatments and see what kind of therapies you have that can fight it instead of partnering someone, for example, for a vaccine?
When I think about the global response across the biotechnology industry, first I would say it's been characterized by unprecedented collaboration. We have major collaborative groups ongoing now across the industry, sponsored by a variety of different groups. We've also had, I think, pretty remarkable sharing of data and information. And really it's centered around three phases that I see, and this is also how Novartis thinks about our own efforts. One was repurposing existing medicines, because we know the profile of existing medicines. And the hope is that maybe some of these medicines will work. Now, it's important to note repurposing is very hard, rarely works. But it's important, nonetheless, to try to see, could we repurpose medicines? Then we go into a phase, can we find some novel therapeutics? And there's a few that are, I think, very exciting, primarily around monoclonal antibodies. These can be infused to kind of give the patient the antibodies they may not have otherwise from a vaccine. And then the third phase will be, vaccines. We have our own company, about 20 medicines now under study in the repurposing phase. We are working to develop our own novel drugs as well. And then, I'm sure as we'll discuss, there's a variety of efforts. I think now over 70 vaccines under study in either late preclinical or clinical development.
About the vaccines, when do you think we'll have a viable vaccine that you and I can take? You helped develop the vaccine against H1N1, and that took 6 months. Can we, be as fast for this one?
I think it's going to be an interesting fall, because we'll learn a lot. When you look at H1N1, there's an important difference in that we understand influenza viruses for over many decades. And we had proven platforms that we knew can generate very strong immune responses, these correlates of protection against influenza. In this case, we have a virus we don't fully understand, and we're using platform technologies which we've never used before. When you look at the various vaccines in development, there are a few different strategies. The fastest have been so-called mRNA vaccines. This is a very novel technology. No mRNA vaccines have been approved yet in the past, but these are the ones we'll first see results for. It's really using the DNA RNA machinery of the body to train the immune system. After that, we'll see a few readouts, we hope, from what are called vector-associated vaccines, and these are using attenuated viruses that we then insert something like the coronavirus in, and then we hope to generate the immune response. And then after that, we'll see more traditional vaccines that we've used in the past. So I think traditional technologies we've used in the past. My guess is by the end of this year, we'll know a lot, but there's going to be important questions we're going to have to answer. The FDA has asked that any vaccine have at least 50% efficacy against the virus. Second, we're going to need to understand the safety. It's important to note there's a big difference between a therapeutic and a vaccine, and that in a therapeutic, you're treating somebody we know is ill. In the case with a vaccine, we're giving an otherwise healthy person a medical intervention. So we really want a safe profile. And then I think the third unknown is the public's acceptance of the vaccine. And I think it's going to be really important we have very rigorous data to support the use of the vaccine so that we don't undermine the public confidence in the vaccine architecture overall.
There's a Russian coronavirus vaccine. Do we know whether it will ever be safe for widespread use?
I think from what I understand of the Russian approach is to take what initial data that we're generating on many vaccines that show that the vaccine generates an immune response and use that as a basis for immunizing populations. This is versus a historical practice, a very aggressive approach. Typically, we know you can often generate an immune response, but we don't know if that immune response matters. Does that protect against the virus? How long does that protection last? And then we don't know anything about safety. We typically want 6 months at least follow-up of a patient to really understand is there any safety signals of concern with a vaccine. So clearly the Russian approach was a much more aggressive approach than what I think the US, Europe, and other jurisdictions will take.
How quickly do you think we'll have a vaccine? I mean, from the first, if we find a formula that works, and then we'll talk about, what else is needed with the vials, the ancillary products, and all of that. But how long will it be safe? Is it 6 months from when we have the formula to test it, or is it longer? Do we actually need longer?
Right now, we're going to have phase 3, probably, if I understand well, the trial designs, 1 month so-called immunogenicity and protection and efficacy results. In the current hope is in the October timeframe. We won't have 6 month safety data, of course, until the last patient has passed 6 months. So that will take us likely into next year. And if you want 1 year of safety data, then you're into the middle of next year. I think the question is going to be from a public policy standpoint, what kind of risk-based approach you want to use to deploy a vaccine. The longer you wait, the more knowledge you're going to have on the vaccine, and the better understanding you'll have on its safety and efficacy profile. I think the hope would be that in the early days, you might be able to deploy a vaccine against those populations that truly need it urgently, first responders, medical personnel, and then over time it can be used in a broader population. I think with reasonable confidence, we could have a safe and effective vaccine before the end of next year that could be used broadly. I think before then, it's going to be a more targeted approach.
Once we have the vaccine formula, and let's call it formula for simplicity's sake, what's the biggest challenge? Is it who you vaccinate, the country that gets it first? Is it distribution, or everything that surrounds it, like the infrastructure, right? So the deep freezers, everything you need to make sure that the vaccine administration is safe.
I wish I could pick one, Francine, but I think it's really all of the above. I mean, once we have a successful formulation, at the same time, vaccines scale up depending on the technology, can be very complex. Each one of these technologies is very different. And so then you'll have to scale up the manufacturing. Then, of course, the distribution, and you're seeing a number of deals being done around the industry. We'll have to see, of course, how that all plays out. And then, of course, the distribution supply chain is very critically important. Depending on the vaccine, some require a pretty rigorous cold chain, as we call it, to really ensure that the vaccine maintains its integrity until it gets to the patients that need it. What gives me hope, though, is the amount of collaboration effort across the industry is unprecedented. I've been on calls. I lead the FDA BRC for pharma, and we are on calls with the FDA discussing how to make this work. The companies are collaborating. There is truly a concerted effort in the biopharmaceutical industry to make this a success, which gives me hope that we can navigate all of these challenges. But I think we have to be realistic. We will have to knock off each one of these challenges as they come.
What's the question that comes up the most in some of the calls you're having, Vass? Is it, how you price it, or just physically how you distribute it, and to which country first?
Most of the questions, at least for now, are focused on the clinical trial designs and how do we get the right clinical trial designs to test these vaccines. Very important in vaccine development is assays. So how do we test? Are we really ensuring what's in the vaccine is what we expect, and then the response in the patients is properly measured? And then the other big topic is manufacturing. I mean, the amount of scale up we're talking about, we talk here about billions of doses of something. This is truly unprecedented. And to get billions of doses of multiple vaccines simultaneously with different technologies is going to require a lot of regulatory support and flexibility, which the FDA, I think, is very open to and working with the companies on. Those have been the two primary areas of focus at the moment.
Who do you think should have the vaccine first? I mean, in terms of country, is it right to think about it like that, or should we think about it differently?
As a public health physician, I think we have to think about it based on risk groups. And I think the right way to deploy a public health intervention is to look at first responders and healthcare personnel, as well as individuals who, in this case, have preconditions such as being immunocompromised or having certain conditions which we know are associated with severe COVID infections. Those are the people who need the vaccine the most when we have limited supplies. And then over time, we expand it. To give you an example, during the H1N1 pandemic of 2009, we understood very well that pregnant women in particular were very susceptible to this particular virus. So at that point in time, the prioritization was made, at least within countries, to focus vaccines on pregnant women first and then expand it into broader populations. That's the kind of thinking we're going to have to take to really effectively deploy vaccines.
What do we understand about T cells and how people actually can, supposedly fight off the virus, not using antibodies, but T cells?
Yeah, so this is, an area of heavy research. In the immune system, we have T-cell-based responses. The T-cell response is based on cells killing infected cells in your own body. And then B cell responses are what create the antibodies. We're measuring both. We don't know exactly which is more important for a COVID infection, but that's what the clinical trials will help us study. It's also important because it'll help us understand what's called immune memory, as I mentioned earlier, because we want hopefully to have patients who are protected longer term so that if they're exposed again to the virus, they can mount a stronger immune response. So I think it remains to be seen which vaccine generates the best T cell response, and is it the T cell or antibodies that matter? We'll only know when we have the data. There's been very interesting data to suggest recently, though, that in patients who are not getting as ill from COVID, their immune systems may have been trained by past infections, which suggests that memory could be something we can generate against COVID-19, but we'll have to see when the clinical trials are completed.
Okay, so do we trust the antibody testing? So I don't know if you can look at the antibody testing and see what percentage of the population in the US or in Europe or in Asia has actually had COVID-19.
So I think the antibody testing for that kind of study, population-based studies, is probably quite reasonable to understand at a population level how much of a population has been exposed, what is the perhaps level of immunity if we understand something more about immunity over time. I think probably where there is still some doubt is for an individual, a given antibody test result, what does that mean for their disposition? Does that really mean they're protected or not? Does that mean that they are 100% safe or not safe at all? I mean, these are all questions we'll only understand through further clinical research. And that brings me, I think, to a really critical point. You know, science is evolving here very quickly. The critical thing that hopefully the listeners can understand, it's important we wait for very rigorously done clinical trials. A trial is not a trial is not a trial. There are studies that are descriptive in nature, which will give us a sense, but are not rigorous enough for us to really know for sure if something is true or not. Well-designed clinical studies, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies are what we need to really know what's going on with respect to this virus. Those studies are happening, and my expectation is in the fall we're going to have an exponential growth in knowledge which will help us better understand this pandemic.
But which studies do you trust? I mean, there's so many, there's so many studies and trials at the moment, that unless you're an expert, sometimes you're drowned with the information.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be a reporter right now having to try to sift through all of these studies. I mean, I think you have to, again, look at the design of the studies. And I know it requires some expertise, but you really want studies that are adequately powered, meaning they have enough patients in them, they're well controlled, they have rigorous hypotheses that are being tested, that they are blinded if appropriate, if it's looking at a drug or a vaccine. In general, those studies are studies that are endorsed by regulators. I mean, the studies that we ultimately do as an industry that are endorsed by FDA or other regulators meet the gold standard. So you can definitely trust those studies because the regulators have signed off on those designs. And then I think the second question is, for, as you've rightfully asked, how do we understand this virus? Epidemiology studies can be done very rigorously, but many of them that I see being reported in the media are not necessarily being done rigorously. So I think it requires expert review to really know for sure.
Vass, when you look at some of the things that we've seen in the US, some of the things that we've seen in Europe, who gets it right in terms of testing? I've heard, from chief executives saying we're testing too much. There are not enough tests out there, either for antibodies or just to see whether you have COVID at that time. And others saying we have to test much more. Which one is it?
I'm personally a believer that we should be testing broadly and testing based on some suspected expectation that a patient has been exposed to COVID. But any suspected case should be tested, and then we should do rigorous contact tracing. Testing and contact tracing has been shown for many, many, many decades as the most effective way to contain large-scale outbreaks. It's the way we eliminated smallpox and ultimately eradicated smallpox from the planet, was rigorous testing and contact tracing. It's the way we've tackled outbreak after outbreak for decades. That doesn't mean indiscriminate testing. That doesn't mean that we should just be testing everybody who feels like they want to be testing. But if you suspect that you've been exposed, you should be tested, and then and if it's positive, then the contact should be traced. There are important innovations that are happening around testing. Pooled testing, where we pool many people together to overcome the lack of adequate numbers of tests, is one interesting approach that's being used in many communities around the world. There are others, but I think we should be testing rigorously when we suspect a case.
Is there so much money in research and development in fighting and curing COVID or finding a vaccine that it takes it away from other diseases?
I'm not so concerned about pulling away R&D dollars. I think we do have to be concerned about the other, let's call it, hidden cost of this pandemic. We saw throughout April, May, and June that patients, whether it was for cardiovascular disease, cancer, other severe illnesses, were not seeing their physicians on a regular basis. We saw cancer diagnosis rates go down, visits to emergency room for heart attacks and stroke go down. So you have to worry that patients who need other care are not getting that care. One of the things I think we have to really be prepared for, if we do see a significant second wave around the world in Europe or a continued resurgence in the US, we need to understand how to operate healthcare systems for the patients who need care on an ongoing basis while also coping with the pandemic. I don't think we can afford just to shut down hospital systems and only have COVID patients treated. The cost to many, many millions of other patients will simply be too high.
Is a second wave almost inevitable?
I don't think it's inevitable. I think when you look at basic public health measures, they have a tremendous effect. We see that here in Switzerland, where I sit today. We see it in many European countries. That doesn't mean we won't see outbreaks. I expect we will continue to see isolated outbreaks. But as long as we can find those outbreaks, appropriately contact trace and isolate, hopefully those outbreaks can be contained. But it really requires human behavior to fundamentally stay very vigilant for the coming months.
Do you worry, Vass, that actually this will lead to a lot less people getting vaccinated? And I'm not thinking about, vaccination against COVID-19, but just vaccinations in general. There seems to be, at the margins, a backlash that's been growing in recent months.
So I'm concerned on two levels. One, I'm concerned about the general anti-vaccine backlash. I mean, it's important to note, first, that medical innovation, that the companies that I think are represented by the biopharmaceutical industry, has enabled life expectancy to increase from 35 years, 100 years ago, to now 80, 90 years plus all around the world through medical innovation. And one of the most important innovations was vaccines. I mean, vaccines probably have led to greater life expectancy gains and quality of life gains than any other intervention. Yet, we still live in a world where children are under-vaccinated, adults are under-vaccinated. I certainly don't think we can afford to see vaccine compliance rates drop, as you rightfully say there are. And then we're also seeing, because hospital systems are under strain, kids are not getting their normal routine vaccinations because, again, they can't get to their clinicians. So I think on both fronts, we have to be super vigilant. I think what would be a tragedy if a few years from now we start to see measles outbreaks or mumps outbreaks or other outbreaks of diseases we had well under control because of a lack of vaccination.
What do you see as, us being prepared or not so prepared for the next pandemic? Is it PPE? What do we need to think about now so that in 4, 5, 10 years, 15 years, we won't be going through the same that we did this time?
This has been a topic I've been, I think, tackling for probably over a decade, since H1N1, or even before we had the H5N1 outbreaks in 2005 and 6. And we know what we need to do, at least the basics. We know that there are a limited number, 1,000, maybe 2,000 so-called zoonotic hotspots, and we need to vigilantly monitor them. These are places where we see viruses, or maybe bacteria, typically viruses, jump from animals into humans. We need to monitor these locations vigilantly. When we see something jump, we need a global framework through organizations like the WHO that rapidly disseminate the information. We need to protect the countries that have these outbreaks from the economic fallout from reporting an outbreak. But when there is an outbreak, they should report, and then the world needs to know. And then we need to create warm preparedness in the public health system. This, everything from personal protective equipment and ventilators, all of those things that should just be ready at the hospitals. But also within our industry, technology platforms like the ones we're building right now with COVID-19 that are ready to go to tackle whichever virus it is that springs up. These are things we could do. It would take investment, of course, but we know that will help us at least limit the impact of any future pandemics.
But can the WHO do that without the US? Does the WHO even make sense without the US?
I think it is certainly a challenging time for the WHO, but at least from our perspective, we believe having an international health framework is critically important, particularly with respect to standards and outbreaks. And I think organizations like the WHO play an incredibly important role in trying to harmonize approaches across such diverse countries. So we'll have to see how things evolve with the WHO, but clearly it has played historically an incredibly important role in managing outbreaks and pandemics.
Is there another organization, Vass, that you think would be just as appropriate, if not more appropriate? I mean, you said, there's a lot more collaboration amongst pharmaceutical companies. Do you see the same amongst countries?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think countries regionally are collaborating, certainly within the European Union. I think, but I don't necessarily see in these moments as much collaboration across countries, of course, because of the demands of meeting the needs of individual populations. I think our industry has shown we can collaborate very effectively. I think we could strengthen the ability to collaborate, to manage pandemics more effectively. If you think about the challenge of supplying vaccines and supplying therapeutics, if we had an international framework that enabled companies to navigate that much more seamlessly, where countries really agreed on which patient populations needed the vaccine or drugs first, that would be, I think, highly desirable. It doesn't exist today at the moment.
How was it leading a big pharmaceutical company in the middle of lockdown from your house?
It's been interesting. I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot about my children. That's been great. There's been a lot more time, family time. I think I had more consecutive meals at home than I've had in at least a decade, which has been wonderful. I think overall, what I've been impressed by is on a few dimensions. One, with the use of technology in our company, at least, we've been able to run the operation seamlessly. We're continuing to deliver over 70 billion doses of medicine this year. We're running over 500 clinical trials. The operations have been able to run despite us moving most of our workforce to home. Second, of course, is the explosion of digital technologies. I mean, the ability to use in our clinical trials, use digital technologies, reaching patients, running our supply chains. This has really accelerated the digital transformation in the biopharmaceutical industry. And we, as being one of the leaders in deploying data science, I think that's really helped us quite a bit. And then I think, third, this is going to completely change the way we work. We've made the announcement at Novartis to enable flexible working 100% going forward, to leave this choice with the associates. Do they want to work at the office or at home? How that new way of working is going to evolve over the coming years is going to be really interesting. And what do we do with our office space in the future as well?
So when you talk about digital technology, is that AI, or is it slightly different to AI, and how that will change the medical world?
Yeah, I think it's primarily using data science in different ways, including AI. So particularly with respect to clinical trials, we've been able to deploy technologies that allow us to monitor all our trials in real time, and then move many of our activities to what we call remote monitoring or remote ways of tracking our clinical trials. We used to have to send people to all of our different clinical trial sites. Now we can use the technology to enable us to do that. Similarly, on our supply chain now, I mean, with data science, we can predict where do we have the need for more supply, more API, and then adapt accordingly. These technologies now are going to scale, and our company, I imagine, across the sector. And I think that's going to be pretty transformative for us going forward.
Vass, thank you so much for joining us, Nas. Vass Narasimhan, they're the Chief Executive of Novartis. And with that, first of all, thank you so much. We'd like to introduce now my colleague from Bloomberg Intelligence. He's Sam Fazeli, who also joins us from London. Sam, take it away.
Hello and welcome everyone to the second part of this event. Today, I want to give you some insight into the pharmaceutical and biotech sector and the short and long-term impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on drug makers. So on our first slide, you can see a very top view of what's changed for the pharma sector in general. In the near term, there have been several impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic. We have marketing challenges, which have led to increased use of digital for pharmaceutical companies in terms of reaching physicians. Patients have not been seeing their doctors, therefore that's resulted in reduced prescription levels. Delayed diagnoses have led to fewer new patient starts for new drugs and older drugs. Elective procedures, of course, have been put on ice in hospitals, which has led to an impact on surgical and device sales. And there have been delays in clinical trials, although a lot of them have restarted again. And over the long term, we have changes in marketing, which we think is going to continue to impact the sector in a positive way. Economic pressures to impact drug pricing is something that we expect to become a reality, more of a reality going forward. And you've got obviously consumer health behavior that will change as a result of the macroeconomic conditions, and potentially increased investment in vaccines and anti-infectives, given what we've just been through. So on the second slide, I'm going to dig deep a little bit more into the actual events things that changed in first quarter and second quarter for the pharmaceutical industry, large pharmaceutical industry. In the first quarter, almost every large pharma beat consensus, sales and EPS, as a result of a pantry filling by consumers of healthcare products, and also physicians increasing prescription sizes in advance of worrying about whether their patients are going to have access to drugs. In the second quarter, you almost had the opposite of this. Many missed. Some were more prudent than others in terms of their guidance. So AbbVie, Johnson & Johnson, and Merck are examples of those who perhaps were too pessimistic in their guidance at Q1. But you basically had most companies pay back what they had gained in the first quarter, plus some more. Marketing costs fell, but R&D rose in most cases, some because of COVID trials that they've started doing, COVID vaccines, COVID drugs. And then travel vaccines, talking about vaccines, were hit quite hard, obviously, that's not a surprise. And adult vaccines have had an impact because people are not going for their booster shots or for new inoculations. And animal health ended up doing a bit better than, with the only company impacted here being Merck Pharmaceuticals, a bit better than expected. On slide 3, I take this a little bit further and look at 22 as a whole. Most companies expect a return to normal in terms of healthcare provision through Q3. A lot of recovery has already taken place into the June-July period, but they're pretty much returned to normal by Q4. Adult vaccines, still tough to call because we don't know yet whether people are that incentivized to go out, but the prescription trends seem good. And obviously, we have the potential for higher vaccination rates in the influenza and pneumonia area, but capacity is a little bit of an issue there. And beyond that, we expect to see further pressure on drug prices in the US, and of course, political pressure is going to be increasing going into the presidential elections in November. Cash-strapped European governments are likely to continue to drive down on prices, with the impact more likely to come through in the next 2 or 3 years, taking a lesson from what we learned in the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And also you have an impact in Europe, more likely on the older drugs, again, based on what we learned that time, than new innovative drugs, which of course is important because it tells you that pharma needs to continue to innovate. On the next slide, so we come back to that point. How can pharma address these issues? Innovation has got to be the way to do it. And both internal and external, buy more biotechs, do more biotech deals. Debt is cheap, so large pharma should have access to pretty reasonable cash balances as and when needed. Obviously, some companies have got better, lighter balance sheets than others. But what's interesting, of course, here in that we are coming to a world where it's not necessarily a bad thing also to be a second or third drug to market. Examples of these are AbbVie's Rinvoq, which is a JAK inhibitor in the rheumatoid arthritis and associated types of diseases that's second or third to market, in fact, that could potentially have best-in-class profile. And the other one is Eli Lilly's breast cancer drug, as an example. So innovation is key. Now, I wanted to spend a moment now looking at market behavior. I've taken the share prices of the US large pharma companies here. And what I've found is that in the world of large pharma, it's fundamentals that have mattered. If you look at Merck and in blue and Bristol Myers in lighter blue share price since the beginning of the year, you find a relative underperformance. And I think some of that's been due to the fact that obviously they have highly dependent, although Bristol Myers less so now, on hospital drugs that need to be administered in the hospital. So there's a worry about that in terms of patients' access to drugs. Merck obviously has the animal health business, and it's got even more hospital drugs such as Bridion, which are used in surgical procedures, which have been hit even harder. And that company had a pretty significant cut to its guidance for 2020. The flip side of that, you see a company like Lilly, 60% up on the year to date. And you can see two big jumps. You can see obviously the return, the rapid return from the March lows that we saw with just about every company, and a rapid rise, and then a sharp jump in June, which of course is to do with their breast cancer drug reading out a lot earlier than expected in a positive form, where Pfizer's drug that was in a similar but not the same type of trial had failed. So pharma has been driven by fundamentals from what we expect, from what we see. Biotech is slightly different. And the two top charts here, you have the XBI, which is a mirror of the S&P 500 biotech index, and then you have the NASDAQ biotech index that are showing some pretty healthy gains, 14.5% for the NASDAQ biotech index, and close to, or just over 19% for the XBI. Now, of course, that hides the story of what really has been interesting and exciting in this sector, which has been the companies involved in making vaccines for COVID-19. So you have a company at the bottom, Novavax, that's up, and that is correct, just over 3,000% since year to date, on the back of their production of a vaccine for COVID-19, for which we just recently saw some data. And then, of course, you have Moderna, who is developing a new mechanism for a vaccine called an RNA vaccine, like Pfizer is doing with other biotech company called BioNTech. So this is what the story of biotech has been. A lot of excitement going into the vaccine players. Now, talking about vaccines for COVID-19, we have a little ever-evolving graphic here that shows some, by various counts, there are 160, 170 vaccines that have been declared in development. And here you have basically a timeline of companies that are developing vaccines. 3 companies are in phase 3 trials in the West. You have Moderna, you have Pfizer, BioNTech, and you have AstraZeneca, who licensed in a vaccine from Oxford University. It is our calculation based on the size of the AstraZeneca trial, which is about 10,000 patients, subjects, versus the other two, which are about 30,000, and the start time of that trial, that they could be the first to report phase 3, the latest stage trials of vaccines. So it's going to be very exciting. It's been breakneck, and it's going to be even more exciting over the next few months. And our call is that we will get at least a short-term protective vaccine for COVID-19. Despite caveats, COVID-19 vaccines prove why investment in science is critical. 2 RNA vaccines are among the leaders. Astra's adenovirus vaccine may have data ahead of others, as I just said, and these are 2 completely new mechanisms of vaccine production, which has not been used before. And 4 companies are racing each other with with therapeutic antibodies, like passive vaccines as opposed to active vaccinations, is what we're talking about here. All of that is coming out of investment, heavy investment in science, and that's paying off now. Biotech investment in VCs, we have clear signs of major hot sizzling sector. 9.7 billion. You can read the numbers on the slide. $9.7 billion invested in private biotechs in first half. It could, if it carries on this pace, excuse me, beat the peak that we already saw in 2018. 6 companies have raised over 200 million in a single round. Sana Biotech raised $700 million in Series 1. These are very serious numbers, and it shows the appetite for investment in biotech. And over $4.3 billion, obviously, a lot of this depends on what your definitions are, have been invested in new biotech-focused VC funds in the first half. So what I want to do quickly now is to thank you all for taking the time to listen to my presentation. And next, I would like to pass you on to my colleague in Bloomberg News, Stephanie Baker, who will introduce the next part of this program. Thank you.
Hi, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Let me begin by introducing our panel. First, we have Dr. Seth Berkley, who is the CEO of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. Seth is a medical doctor and infectious disease epidemiologist. He joined Gavi in 2011, spearheading its mission to protect the world's poorest children by improving access to new and underused vaccines. Great to have you with us today, Seth. Next, we have Kathrin Jensen, who is Senior Vice President and Head of Vaccine Research and Development at Pfizer. Kathrin has over 25 years of pharmaceutical experience in vaccine R&D. And as we heard earlier, Pfizer has partnered with Germany's BioNTech on a promising mRNA vaccine against SARS-CoV-2, which she'll tell us about in a bit. Thank you for joining us today, Kathrin.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you. Last but by no means least, we have Professor Sarah Gilbert, who is leading a team at the University of Oxford's Jenner Institute that's devised one of the leading COVID-19 vaccine candidates, building on her 2 decades of research experience. Her team's effort was featured in a Bloomberg Businessweek cover story that I wrote last month, in case you want to learn more about it. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Stephanie.
So in the public's imagination, the race is on to create a single COVID-19 vaccine that will inoculate the world's population. In reality, several coronavirus vaccines are under development, and multiple approaches will be necessary to achieve global immunity. In this discussion, we'll examine the leading efforts so far, the technologies they are employing, and the longer-term logistics that will be necessary once a vaccine is proven effective. But first, before we go to the panelists, we'll start off with our audience poll question, which is, how many people do you think will be willing to take a COVID-19 vaccine when one becomes available? Less than 20% of people, less than 50% of people, more than 50%, more than 75%. So while we wait for the results of the poll to come in, we'll go to our panelists, and I'd like to start with Sarah. As you said earlier, you've already started phase 2-3 trials in the UK, Brazil, and South Africa involving more than 10,000 people after initial promising results. We know that the UK's rate of infection has declined despite some recent upticks, and that it could take a while to prove the vaccine's effectiveness here. But given the rate of infection in Brazil and South Africa, can you tell us when you think you might get an efficacy result from the trials there? Have you enrolled enough volunteers there to get a result quickly?
We don't yet have clarity on the timelines for those trials. We have enrolled most of the 10,000 people that we intend to include in the UK trial, and that's people of all ages over 18, no children included yet, but we have older adults in 2 age groups. The first trial was in 18 to 55-year-olds, and then we had 2 other age groups, 56 to 69 and 70 plus, and those adults are being vaccinated now in our UK trials. In Brazil, we're aiming for a total of 5,000 to be recruited. There is potential to expand that if it proves to be useful to do that. And in South Africa, it's actually a phase 1/2 study, so that's a smaller study. It's around about 1,000 or 1,200 people, again initially with the possibility of expansion. So the time that it will take to get the efficacy result really depends on the rate of infection in those different countries, and particularly in the populations that we're immunizing. We're prioritizing healthcare workers because they have more likelihood of exposure and are more likely to give us a readout early. But it isn't possible to say when we're going to have that result. We just need to keep following the trials, counting the cases, and we're still in discussions with regulators about when would be a good point to actually unblind those studies. We don't want to be unblinding the trials too early. You can't have multiple looks at the data. It affects the statistical outputs of the trial, so you have to decide in advance how many cases you want to see before you unblind and get your interim efficacy result, and those discussions are still ongoing.
Right. And now you said earlier that you would start a large phase 3 study in the US this month. When is that likely to begin, and where?
So that's a trial that's being organized and sponsored by AstraZeneca. The trials in the UK, in Brazil and South Africa are sponsored by the University of Oxford. But AstraZeneca, who have licensed the vaccine from us and have taken over the large-scale vaccine manufacturing, will be responsible for the trial in the US. So it's over to them to make the final decision about exactly when that's going to start. I know that vaccine supply is not going to be an issue for that trial, and I would expect it to be starting very soon. I think it's still likely to start this month.
Right. And India, I know that there are plans for India to start a phase 3 trial.
India will probably start with a phase 2. So Serum Institute of India have a sub-license from AstraZeneca to license the vaccine, and they will be working with Indian research organizations to run trials there. Again, vaccine manufacturing has been underway in India, and they're now in the final stages of preparation for getting ready for trials there.
Okay. Let's turn to Kathrin. Pfizer and BioNTech also announced the start of a phase 2/3 study for their mRNA vaccine involving 30,000 people at the end of July after some encouraging early data. Can you tell us how many people have been enrolled so far? And then crucially, I know that your CEO has said that he expects to file data on the vaccine with the FDA in October. Is that a realistic time frame? Are you still on track to do that?
Yeah, hi, Stephanie. So first of all, thank you for having us on this panel. Much appreciated. And I just like, as a little introduction, to just say that I think the race is on not to have a single vaccine to protect against this global pandemic, but the race is on to protect against this terrible pandemic. I just checked actually the numbers just today, with 55,000 new infections and 1,500 deaths just yesterday. That's who our real enemy is. And as we heard earlier, I think companies and other entities are working closely together to make sure that at the end there's enough vaccine supply that can satisfy a world population of 7.8 billion as we have it today. So yes, we have started our phase 2/3 study actually on 27th of July. And it is also a 30,000 participant study, randomized 1-to-1. And we have made a number of assessments in terms of, how fast we can enroll. And I'm glad to say that we're on track in a very aggressive plan to enroll these 30,000 participants. When it comes to the endpoint, and as was noted before, of course, all of those studies are endpoint-driven studies. We have powered our study to at least demonstrate a vaccine efficacy of 60%. So, assuming that we are right in our assumptions on attack rate and the speed on which we can enroll, and assuming that the efficacy may be better than 60%, we have also designed a study to have several interim analyses. So if we see the attack rate that we're anticipating, if our vaccine is actually better in efficacy than it was powered for, then there is an opportunity for us to see efficacy earlier at those interim analyses, even before all of the participants are enrolled. So assuming that could be a reality, then of course we can come and declare a success as early, as we said, as October. Now, it was very important to us, and we have worked very closely with the FDA, that this study is conducted in a way that we are certain about the vaccine efficacy. And the FDA has given us very stringent, and not just us, but everyone who's conducting phase 3 studies in the United States, very stringent success criteria. And that was another reason why we needed the larger sample size. And it was also made very clear that even if one is successful with an interim analysis, that those success criteria and those stringent success criteria have to be demonstrated.
So you're not worried, like Sarah, about unblinding the studies too early?
No, we won't unblind studies too early for the reasons I just described. We want to have a successful study that meets the expectation and guidelines of the regulatory agencies. And therefore, we will, as I said, we have put in several interim analyses that if we are successful, then yes, we can declare success earlier, but exactly under the same stringent acceptance criteria that we agreed with the regulators are the right acceptance criteria.
Okay, and I'm going to get a little granular with the next question, so I hope the audience can follow me here. You released phase 1 data on one vaccine candidate, 162b1, but then you began final stage trials on a slightly different vaccine, 162b2, that you haven't published anything about. What's the structural difference between the vaccines, and why did you switch? Why publish one and then move ahead with the other?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Stephanie, and it was actually a very interesting development. As you know, we had originally put, as I say, 4 horses in the race, actually 4 different RNA vaccine constructs, and we did that for a reason, because we wanted to really make sure that our decision on which candidate to drive forward is based on clinical data and not just preclinical data. So as we were evaluating in the United States and German in our 2 sister trials in phase 1, the 4 candidates, it became very clear that the modified RNA candidate, and we had B1 entered into the clinical study before we entered B2, was actually looking better than the other 2 candidates. So we put a lot of emphasis on this to get data with B1. And as B2 entered the race, so to speak, we had already generated with the modified RNA platform a significant safety and tolerability data that allowed us to actually go with B2 much faster than what we were able to do with B1. The difference between the 2, before I talk about what actually transpired when we looked at the totality of the data, is that the B1 is a modified RNA construct designed to only express the receptor binding domain of the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. And it's a construct that was also designed to be secreted. The B2 construct is the full-length spike protein that is actually membrane bound. So when we were generating the data for B1, we were actually also generating then data for B2. They were lagging behind. And so we learned a lot about B1. It looked very promising. So we published the data. And then the final data came in for B2. And when we compared the 2, we had a number of criteria that we compared the two candidates. For and foremost, we wanted to look at the safety and tolerability profile. We wanted to make sure that we get good SARS-CoV-2 neutralizing antibodies. We wanted to make sure that we have a strong T-cell response, both a CD4 as well as a CD8 T-cell response. And of course, we took some of our preclinical data into consideration as well. So we were actually almost ready to make a decision for B1 when then the B2 data came all in and we were able to compare and contrast. And what became very clear, and we'll publish those data soon, is that the safety and tolerability profile for the B2 construct that expresses the total spike protein was more favorable compared to a B1, while at the same time we saw a very similar antibody response, particularly neutralizing antibody response. And
right. So, in other words, the safety profile of the second candidate looked a bit better. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly true. And, it was literally decisions were made within a couple of days as the data came in of which candidate to move ahead. And it turned out to be B2.
Right. Okay, so let's go back to Sarah on the whole safety issue as well, because I think it's a thing that is of concern in the general public and often gets kind of blown out of proportion or misreported. Sarah, in your phase 1 trial, I know that you gave participants paracetamol before vaccination. Why is that? And can you elaborate on the side effects from your vaccine? How do you rate the side effects you're seeing relative to other vaccines that many people get routinely?
So when we were doing vaccine development with our coronavirus vector vaccine, we'd used 3 different doses in those clinical studies, and we saw immune responses to all of them, but with the strongest immune responses at the highest dose, although it was somewhat more reactogenic than the intermediate dose, which was half the level of the lowest dose. In a pandemic situation, when you're trying to get the best response you can with the single dose, we decided we would go for the highest dose, knowing that in some participants, they might have a very short-lived fever. And that's the main difference between the 2 different dose levels, is that a small proportion of the participants do have a short-lived fever immediately after vaccination, within the first 48 hours. And it's very predictable in terms of the time. And as with any vaccine, other adverse events after vaccination are tenderness or some pain at the injection site, mostly mild in most participants, and fatigue as well. And the safety profile of the COVID-19 vaccine is very, very similar to all of the other Challux-1 vectored vaccines that we've worked on previously and published the data on previously. We're not seeing anything unexpected. But because some of the participants do experience a short-lived low-grade fever, we decided we would see if we had any impact on that by giving them paracetamol for the first 24 hours after vaccination, which has been done with some other vaccines in implementation studies as well. And it seemed that there was a slight reduction in the number of people experiencing fever if they took paracetamol for the first 24 hours after vaccination, which is not a difficult thing to do. So we tested that, and we showed the effect of the vaccination with and without paracetamol, and the slight reduction in the reactogenicity if they did take the paracetamol.
Okay. Let's bring in Seth. Obviously, the crucial question is how to make sure any vaccine that's approved gets distributed widely. Can you tell us, Seth, what Gavi's been doing to ensure the whole accessibility around the world, and explain, to our viewers what the COVAX facility is and how that's working?
So thank you, Stephanie. Gavi, of course, was set up to make sure that vaccines could get out to the developing world. And we've been quite successful introducing 496 new vaccines in the last 20 years and immunizing close to 1 billion people by now. So when the COVID issue came up, we thought, okay, we'll look at developing countries, but we realized that, in fact, there was a risk that what was going to happen, what happened in 2009 with the swine flu, and that is a small number of countries would buy up doses and there wouldn't be doses for everyone else. So we set up this COVAX facility. It's interesting, 173 countries have expressed interest in that. 92 developing countries who we would normally deal with, but also 81 upper middle income and high income countries. And the idea is for the developing countries, we work with donors to try to get funds to subsidize their vaccines and help them with delivery. But for the upper middle income and high income countries, that in essence, we provide an opportunity for them to work together to have a large portfolio of vaccines. We're aiming somewhere between 12 and 15 vaccines, since we don't know which, if any, of these are going to work. And to maximize that chance of success would be to have a large number of vaccines in the portfolio.
Right. And I believe you've done 2 deals so far with vaccine manufacturers, one with AstraZeneca with the Oxford vaccine and another with Novavax. How many more deals do you think you might be able to secure by the end of the year on the manufacturing side, and explain a little bit how that works?
So as I said, we're aiming to have 12 to 15 vaccines in the portfolio. We're working also with the sister organization, the Coalition of Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, so-called CEPI. They bring 9 vaccines to the table, of which 7 of them are in clinical trials. The Gates Foundation is also bringing vaccines to the table. So we've got 18 vaccines that we potentially can work with, but we're open for business for any manufacturer that has promising vaccines. What we're trying to do is balance the portfolio and make sure that we have representatives of the different types of vaccines, whether they be mRNA vaccines we just talked about, viral vectored vaccines, protein vaccines, et cetera. And that is because we want to make sure we maximize the chance of success.
And do you have enough funding? I know that you've sent, I think you said a target of $2 billion for the COVAX manufacturing facility. How much have you raised so far?
So it's 2 different aspects. So for the developing countries, we initially said we wanted to start by the end of the year and getting 2 billion, but probably we'll need somewhere between 5 and 7 billion for the target of having 1 billion doses of vaccine. Of course, we don't know what the prices are. Is it going to be the 2 vaccine leaders that we have with us? The pricing of those 2 vaccines are probably very different. And so we're estimates at this point, we've raised 600 million to get that jump started. For the other billion doses, which would be for upper middle income and high income countries, that will depend upon those countries putting finance in the facility and being able to put money up front to be able to lock in doses for them. And the deadline for them joining the facility is the end of this month. And so we'll see how many of those countries actually put money in to go ahead and do the deals with companies.
Right. Okay, so Kathrin, I know that Pfizer has worked with Gavi in the past on other vaccines. Will you be doing a deal with them for your COVID vaccine? Can you tell us anything about that?
Yes, that's actually something that is in active discussions because very clearly it's important that we are not just protecting with our vaccines the developed world, but also pay attention to lower middle income countries. As Seth already explained, there's a lot of lives that need protection. So yes, we plan to do what we always do for our vaccines, to make sure that if Gavi is interested in that, we make our vaccines available. And so this vaccine should be no different. Of course, there is a bit more of an urgency of making sure that the images that Gavi would require, how the vaccine is packaged, multi-dose versus single dose, whatever, that all needs to be discussed and negotiated, and also the number of doses that Gavi would be interested in.
Right. Now, Sarah, when your team at Oxford was having talks to find a potential pharmaceutical partner, as I understand, did you insist that they provide the vaccine on a not-for-profit basis, sort of at cost around the world? I mean, the AstraZeneca Oxford model does stand out because of this promise to provide it, at cost. Was that a sort of important issue for you? Was it a deal breaker for you?
Yes, that was really important to the university. So across the board, everything that we're doing in response to the COVID pandemic is not for profit. During the period of the pandemic, the university will not make money from this, and the university doesn't want any manufacturing partner, any commercial partner, to make money from this vaccine work during the pandemic. There is potential for future supply. We don't know how long we're going to need this vaccine for, and that's still to be decided. But it was also really important to those of us who are working on the early development of the vaccine, and as opposed to the people in the university offices who think about the role of the university in the world. It was really important to us that we had commitment to supply to low and middle income countries and to supply large amounts of vaccine. We didn't want a deal with a manufacturer that just ended up in supply for a few high-income countries and left the rest of the world aside. And we've been really impressed with AstraZeneca's work that they've put in. They have a really impressive global manufacturing arrangement put into place. They're using manufacturers across the world with the plan of supplying locally to different parts of the world. They're working with Serum Institute, but also many other manufacturers in different areas, so that they've committed to make 2.1 billion doses of this by next summer, and they may even end up going further than that. So we're really pleased that our commercial partners are making the commitment to supply to the whole world and not just a small part of the world.
Right. Now, Kathrin, I believe your vaccine and mRNA vaccines generally need to be kept at -70, -80, the frozen chain. Isn't that going to be challenging to roll out globally? And what are you trying to do to overcome this challenge?
Yeah, so you're correct, Lauren. Stephanie, the current formulation is a -70 frozen formulation. And we do not think that there is currently, the way we have configured this, and particularly in combating the pandemic, that there is a big issue with the storage at those temperatures. We have developed, number one, we have a very global distribution network for all of our vaccines that have the capability at the distribution centers to keep the vaccine at those temperatures. We have very sophisticated shippers developed that allow us to ship vaccine all over the place in the world and keep the vaccine in a shipper at the required temperature for about 10 days, and then it would need to be re-iced. Now, these shippers are coming in all kinds of sizes, so they can be very well customized for where the vaccine needs to go in the world, coming from a distribution center and being rolled out. And just if you imagine for a moment, since time is of the essence, and assuming that the vaccines are successful and they are being licensed and can be rolled out, we would anticipate those are mass immunizations to make sure that as large number of individuals can be immunized as possible. And so you can imagine that even with a frozen vaccine, once it's thawed, you probably have a large number of individuals already on standby to be immunized, that this per se should not be an issue. However, we are also working on a lyophilized formulation for the RNA. And so that could become a reality. I don't know exactly when, but preliminary data are coming in, and they look actually encouraging. So that would be
okay. Can I bring in? Sorry, can I interrupt? Sorry to interrupt. Can I bring in Seth? I just wanted to get your view on, the how realistic it is to try to roll out sort of deep frozen vaccines in low-income countries. How much of a challenge will that be from your perspective?
Well, of course, we would prefer the vaccine to be at room temperature, but if it's the vaccine that works, we will do our best to get it out. We did, with the Ebola vaccine, get it out in eastern DRC in the middle of a war zone, and we're able to vaccinate 330,000 people with that vaccine using the ultra cold chain and using these cool technology called Arctex, which allowed you to keep the vaccines for about a month at those temperatures without any electricity. And then we brought some deep freezers as well. It's not ideal. You couldn't do it everywhere, but you probably could do health workers in a capital city or something like that. So I think for us, the challenge is to try to figure out what vaccines work here and then to optimize them. And we appreciate what we heard, that the lyophilized vaccines might be the way to go here if this turns out to be the most promising or one of a number of promising vaccines.
Right. Okay. Sarah, can I ask you one question on the whole issue of challenge trials? I think there's been a lot of talk about, that might be a quicker way to get a result to vaccinate people and then deliberately expose them to the virus. I think you've said that you don't see that happening in the short term, but can you see any scenario where that might happen?
Yeah, I think it will happen in the future. But it's a very complex area. So I've worked on flu vaccine challenge trials before. We do malaria vaccine studies here in Oxford, and we do typhoid challenges. And it takes a long time to set these models up. And then you have to have a really good understanding of what the model's telling you. So using these models, it's only possible to do the studies in very healthy young individuals, and these are not the people who get severe disease with COVID. There has to be a rescue therapy available so that if anybody unexpectedly develops some more severe disease or isn't able to clear the disease after they've been infected, they can be treated very effectively and very rapidly. And remember that you're not going to bank on the vaccine working so people won't get infected, because you always have to have a control group. You have to have a group of people who do get infected during the challenge so that the challenge itself actually works. And the people who've been vaccinated, if they don't then get infected, it's because the vaccine worked. And then there's a problem in the fact that we need to use very young and healthy individuals for these challenge studies, that most of them won't get infected when you give them the challenge. So when we do malaria challenge studies, with people who've never been exposed to malaria before, we can reliably infect 100% of the control group with our malaria challenge, and we can reliably treat all of them because the strain we use is sensitive to all known antimalarials. And so that all works and is ethically acceptable. For COVID, if we're exposing young and healthy people, we're probably going to get a really low take rate. For flu, it's about 60%, 70% in a good trial. And that's when you screen people not to have antibodies to that particular strain of flu. So I doubt it's going to be any higher than that. So that then, for COVID, that leads you to do very large challenge studies, and then trying to interpret what that means in terms of the response in the wider population is quite difficult. So I think we actually need to understand how the vaccines work in the real world, in field efficacy studies, which is what we're all involved in now. But then if we have other vaccines that are coming along, and we want to know if they would also be as effective. If the immune response looks to be as good as a vaccine that's already demonstrated efficacy, and we don't want to do another 30,000 subject field trial with this new vaccine, which maybe has some advantages, or maybe we just need another vaccine because we need to supply the whole world, you might be able to bridge across to that by doing the challenge trials. But they're not the whole answer. Okay. And I actually think it's going to take a while to set the models up.
Right. I wanted to go to the results of our polling question. According to the results that are in, less than 20%, for the less than 20% that would get a vaccine, it's 14 people. Less than 50% getting the vaccine, it's 89 people. More than 50% is 105 people. More than 75% is 32 people. So it looks like most people think just over 50% of people will end up getting the vaccine, which sort of mirrors some of the polls that are out there, but they're kind of all over the place right now. Lastly, before we go, there were a couple of questions from the audience on the same subject that I thought I'd put to our panelists. Both Jeff from California and Judy from New Jersey would like to know how likely is it that mutations to the virus will make it harder to find an effective vaccine? Wonder if both Kathrin and Sarah could weigh in briefly on that. Sarah, do you want to go first?
Yeah, maybe.
So the neutralizing antibodies that are induced by vaccines bind to the receptor binding domain, which is the part of the virus that has to bind with the receptor on the cell if the virus is going to get inside that cell. And if the receptor binding domain mutates very much, then it doesn't work. If if it doesn't mutate, is recognized by the antibody. So if the virus changes too much, it's not going to be able to invade cells anymore. Certainly with the type of vaccine we use, as well as the neutralizing antibodies, we get a very good, strong CD8 T cell response, which is recognizing infected cells. And I think that's going to turn out to be really important because we're seeing quite a bit of cell-to-cell spread. So it's hiding away in cells and antibodies can't reach it anymore. And the T cell response is to the whole of the spike protein. And if there are some mutations in that in one part, you still have a T cell response that recognizes the rest of it. So I think mutations are not going to be a really serious problem, at least in the short term. Over years, we may see some drift and maybe a need to update vaccines, but not in the first year of vaccination.
Kathrin, would you agree?
Yeah, so we actually have looked at that experimentally and have evaluated about 17 different variants, spike protein variants, and have demonstrated that our vaccine Immune Sera were able to neutralize all of the variants quite similarly. So we didn't see any impact on any of the variants.
Right. Well, we have run out of time. I could keep you here for much longer and ask you loads more questions. And I'm sorry I didn't get to all of my questions, but thank you all for joining me today. Next up, we have my colleague from Bloomberg News, John Fraher, joining us from London. Over to you, John. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello and welcome everyone to the final part of this event. Joining us today, we have 3 leaders within the world of healthcare. Firstly, we have Professor Neil Ferguson. He is the founding director of the MRC Centre for Global Infectious Disease Analysis at Imperial College London. A former member of the UK government's SAGE advisory body, he co-authored a highly influential report in mid-March about the spread of the virus that was instrumental in prompting the UK into going into full lockdown. Our second speaker is Professor Devi Sridhar, who is professor at the University of Edinburgh Medical School and holds a personal chair in global public health. Thank you for joining us today. And last but by no means least, we have Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, who is the chief scientist at the WHO, and she is joining us today from via phone link from Mumbai. So we're here today to talk today about what COVID tells us about the future of pandemics. MERS, SARS, and not to mention a renewed Ebola outbreak have all hit us in the past 20 years. So it was with alarm that we read in June about another potential emerging case, a new strain of H1N1 swine flu spreading among pig workers in China. It seems that deadly transmissible viruses are becoming more and more common in the modern world. So the question is, are pandemics becoming more likely? If so, why? And if they are, what can we do about it? Professor Sridhar, let me start with you. Should we see COVID-19 as a one-off, or is it a reminder that more pandemics like this could be just around the corner?
Yeah, so I think the virus SARS-CoV-2 that causes COVID-19 is quite difficult in some ways to control because of the issues of asymptomatic transmission. It has certain characteristics that make it very hard for public health measures to be able to handle it. On the flip side, I think what we've seen over the past couple years, past decade, is increasing numbers of viruses and bacterial infections spilling over into humans. And so as long as we continue to have close contact between animals and humans, we will continue to see spillover events. And we're seeing that through urbanization, deforestation, having wet markets. So I think right now we should use this experience to learn and prepare for the next virus, and also not underestimate this virus itself, SARS-CoV-2, which I think will present problems for the years to come. It's not going to go away anytime soon or in any simple way.
Dr. Swaminathan, what is your view? Do you share the view that pandemics are becoming more like this, are becoming more likely?
I think that with the changes that we see in the world today, that pandemics are going to occur. And this is something that WHO and many other bodies have predicted. It's a question of when and not if. An influenza pandemic is something that everyone, is trying to prepare for, because all the previous pandemics have been from the influenza virus. But we also know there are many viruses that are circulating in animals and that can jump the species barrier to humans at any time. And in fact, a few years ago, when the R&D blueprint was was set up by the WHO. This was following the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. There was a disease there, a pathogen called pathogen X, which could cause disease X, which was essentially meant to underline the possibility that the world may be faced with a pandemic or a large epidemic due to an unknown pathogen. And the idea was really to say, how do you prepare for something like that? Of course, the focus there was on R&D, on the ability to develop diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines for some of the priority pathogens that we know, but also what we don't know. And so I think it's been there. It's just that I guess it's human nature not to take things very seriously and prepare until a disaster happens. And I hope that at least this time, there's been so much suffering and such huge cost to everyone around the world, both in terms of human cost and economic cost, that the world will take it seriously and will prepare at least to be better, able to respond to the next big one.
So, Professor Ferguson, what is your view about the likelihood of more pandemics? A lot of the conversation over the last 6 months looking to the future is, oh my gosh, what if it's this bad for COVID, what is it going to be like when the big one happens? But statistically, how likely is it that we will see something worse than this in the next 10, 20 years?
So, this is the big one in some sense. I think if you replayed the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic today, you would have something which looks a lot like what we're seeing with COVID in terms of mortality and illness caused, given the world has moved on since 1918. And these sort of pandemics, probably about 1 in 200 year events or so in terms of this level of lethality. I agree with the earlier comments. There's some hint in the data that the frequency of pandemics or emergence of new viruses which could cause a pandemic but sometimes are able to be snuffed out, like SARS, for instance, that frequency is increasing over time for the reasons which Devi stated. I think there's things we can do about it, though. One of the big risk factors for emerging viral diseases like this is human interaction with wildlife, and in particular, killing wildlife for food, so-called, game markets in Africa and in Asia. By, frankly, stopping those, we could reduce the risk, but not completely.
How difficult, though, is it? These are practices that are deeply embedded in many cultures. How easy is it for governments just to go in and change that sort of behavior?
I think that varies by setting. I think in China, I think it wasn't appreciated fully quite what the risk was. I suspect those practices will change very rapidly now. Clearly in countries with less good governance, less in terms of governmental structures, it will be much harder. And of course, one of the reasons why people are getting protein sources from wildlife populations, in some cases decimating those populations, is poverty, is lack of food security, and those issues need to be addressed.
Professor Sridhar, can I go to you on that subject? In the background of all of this, of all of these things that Professor Ferguson was just talking about, is climate change. How much of an accelerant do you think climate change is when it comes to the spread of viruses and the transmission of viruses from wildlife to humans?
Yeah, no, I think, climate change has far-reaching effects on that, not only for the new kinds of spillover events, but for existing diseases like malaria, where you might see even, dengue or Zika or any of the viruses also that are held by mosquitoes that might have further ground to cover as temperatures change. So I think, the way we think about human health perhaps has been too narrow. We, focus on what's happening among humans when actually we need to be thinking that humans are part of a larger ecosystem, and that ecosystem includes also animals, because we are also animals and can get those viruses, but also spilling out, larger, to look at the larger picture around environmental determinants of health, and that we need to be, and actually antimicrobial resistance, AMR, is the perfect example of this, that you can't just focus on what's happening in humans and antibiotics. You have to look what's happening with the environment. You need to look what's happening with animals. So I think this is one of the things I hope will change going forward, that we start to look more broadly at human health beyond just, our current systems.
But that said, if you look at the pace of globalization and urbanization and the growth of sort of megacities and places like West Africa, China, obviously, it does feel like, humans are going to be coming in more and more contact with wildlife. Whatever we do about eating practices or whatever, anything like that, this trend is just going to continue.
Yeah,
so it's
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Devi. I was going to say that it's less the growth of megacities, but it's the impingement of human communities, which often in the peri-urban or rural settings, as those populations grow into areas which were previously not inhabited by people, which poses the most risk. So also things like deforestation in South Asia and Latin America is constantly posing a risk of emergence of viruses from animal reservoirs.
Professor Sridhar, did you have a final point on that?
Yeah, I guess I was saying, if you look at the whole system, and Dr. Swaminathan referred to this, which is that, there's 1.7 million viruses circulating among animals. We're not going to stop viruses in animals. We've seen that once they enter and are able to sustain human-to-human transmission, it's pretty hard to stop if it has certain characteristics, such as being, having a mild illness that spreads quite, through respiratory mechanisms, but has a range of symptoms from those which are completely asymptomatic to those who actually die from it. And so where can you stop in the system? What can you do? And I think the best place you can intervene is in that spillover moment to make sure that actually we don't have as many of those incidents. And if that means we have to look at, these cities or cultural practices or all those things, that's what we have to do. We're humans and we evolve, and we've evolved over hundreds of years to deal with public health issues, whether it's clean water or sanitation, other things. And this is just another one of those.
Thank you. So Dr. Soumyathan, I know you have a tight schedule today, so I want to bring you in. Of course, one of the big things we need to think about when it comes to the next epidemic, the next pandemic, is lessons learned from this particular crisis. From where you sit in the WHO, obviously you have a very extremely global view of everything that's gone wrong and maybe some of the things that have gone right. But what to you are the biggest lessons that we need to draw so far from COVID in terms of tackling the next epidemic and pandemic when it comes along?
I think there for the next one, but also tells us, where we haven't focused in the last in the past decades. When we look across the world and look at the epidemiology of this infection, we see that it has wreaked havoc in rich and poor countries alike. So what that tells us is that even amongst high income and upper middle income countries, while their health systems in terms of their tertiary care may be much better than some of the lower middle income countries, the public health aspects were found lacking. Starting from surveillance and early warning systems and being able to detect and respond to early signals, and also then being able to do this very hard work of tracking, tracing, treating, isolating, quarantining, which really requires a workforce and a well-governed public health system. That was the first lesson, that we haven't invested in public health responses. And in fact, in our strategic goals for the next 5 years, we have, the prevention, detection, and response of emergencies as a key goal, along with universal health coverage, because one cannot happen without the other.
And how optimistic or dispirited have you been by the scale of in terms of the government's interacting and coordinating with the WHO? How important is it that we look at improving some of the structures global structures when it comes to dealing with the next pandemic? Because if you look, through history, global crisis tends to be followed by a new regulatory regime. So in the aftermath of the financial crisis, of course, we saw a whole new range of bank regulations around the world. In the aftermath of World War II, of course, we saw the Bretton Woods system set up, the IMF, and the World Bank. What sorts of, do we need to think about new structures when it comes to fighting the next pandemic, or is it a question more of improving the current ones that we have?
Yes. I'm sorry, I think I got cut off. Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now. Did you hear the question?
Yes, I was, I think, halfway through the answer when I said that we have found ourselves lacking in public health preparedness and the ability to respond to early signs of an emerging infectious disease. We have been found lacking in investment, not just in tertiary care, which many countries prioritize, but in soft primary health systems that include laboratory capacity, that include the kind of health workforce that you need on the ground, that includes the community engagement process, part of good delivery of primary health care services. And also, quite importantly, the dialogue with the communities, which actually brings about that you need to have a pandemic like this. I think the third lesson we've learned is about the governance and leadership and how important that is. We've seen the countries that have really responded well have done so because the political leadership, took it seriously, took early note of what was happening, and relied on scientific expertise to the scientists and the public health leaders in their own countries to advise them on what should be the steps that they're taking. And then I think the fourth lesson has really been around science and how science has really, I think, risen up to the challenge. Right from day one, we've seen the whole genome sequence of the virus produced within a couple of weeks of this new virus outbreak being discovered, made publicly available to the world so that diagnostics could be developed very quickly. Even the vaccine candidates started getting developed within a few days of the sequence being released on the public database. And since then, the whole world has been following every scientific development, like never before. I don't think we've ever seen this kind of discussion and debate in the public discourse of what, antibodies are seen or not seen, what sort of after effects of the disease, what progress there's been in therapeutics and vaccines, and a huge profusion of scientific output, starting with China, but then from countries around the world now, which have really, I think, brought us a long way in the last 6 months. And I think everyone agrees that a vaccine is probably the best way out of this acute phase of this pandemic. And of course, everyone's hopes are on a vaccine. But WHO, again, from the beginning, recognized that research is going to be extremely important and that they need in this. And so we brought together scientists from around the world early February to start defining what the research questions are and setting up these international expert groups that started working on everything from epidemiology to the animal origin, to infection prevention and control, the development of core protocols for vaccines and therapeutics. So I think WHO recognized very early and drove the agenda on research, but also there's been tremendous investment by research funders across the world, and we know that many scientists, no matter what they were working on earlier, have now focusing on COVID. So I think that's been a really, really positive and very encouraging sign as far as I can see. Our final test, of course, is to be able to deliver these products to people around the world in an equitable way. And I think that's much more difficult than actually funding or coming out with the solutions. And that's going to be a test for all of us, for all countries really. Are we able to come together and agree that we share these new products, tools, technologies equitably? Or is the rich world going to, benefit disproportionately, and the lower income countries having to wait, as has been the case historically. I hope this time around that things are different, but we're not there yet, and we are working towards that. Over.
Yes, thank you for that thoughtful answer. And I want to get at the end of this section, I want to talk briefly about vaccines and the outlook for the rest of this crisis. But Professor Ferguson, perhaps I can turn to you. I mean, you, of course, were in the beginning of this, were very heavily involved. You were an advisor to the UK government. What, in terms of looking ahead to the next epidemics and the next pandemics and dealing with them when they come, what significant lessons have we drawn and should we apply?
Yes, well, I agree with everything just stated. I think one of the things which will be critical is we don't want to be in a position again, which we were in the UK and actually many countries, the United States, was in the same position where we had way too little testing capacity to really get a good handle on what infection was happening. What is apparent across Europe and in the United States is at a time when basically all of those countries were only testing people coming into the continent from, say, China, as those people being potentially at risk of being infected with COVID, that they missed lots of infection coming into each country and seeding chains of transmission in each of those countries. And so with the lockdown in Italy, that became apparent. They'd been seeing 6 weeks of transmission probably before they detected it. Similarly in New York, similarly, frankly, in the UK and London. We do not want that to be repeated. And so we need to be scaling up for future pandemics. We need to be scaling up testing and surveillance, not just at borders when we get new global pandemics, but each country needs to be looking systematically for the cases it's missed in terms of border controls, which will be most of them, and looking for evidence of sustained transmission in their populations. I think had every country done this, and some did, such as South Korea, then we would have seen a much lower death toll overall.
And Professor Sridhar?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something I think we'll all spend a lot of time looking back, which is if we knew what we know now on December 31st on New Year's Eve, what would we have each done differently with our lives, aside from buying Zoom stock and lots of toilet paper. And I think, for me, the two big surprises out of this, and it's been touched on, is first the spread through elite networks. When we had looked at previous infectious diseases, you're usually looking at poor countries, rural areas, and that emerging and spreading in a different way, where this really spread through business travelers, cruise ships, holidays, skiing holidays, which was just slightly, at least to me, unexpected. And the second was that rich countries would struggle so much that the United States and United Kingdom, which were constantly ranked 1 and 2 in pandemic preparedness, would become 2 of the countries that are still struggling. I mean, the takeaway message I hope for future pandemics is that if you don't deal with your health issues, your economic issues will be so much worse. And that's true in terms of preventing an outbreak or even moving early. There's such a fear of overreaction, of scaremongering. I mean, I think we've learned it's better to overreact early and build those testing labs and not use them than to sit around and wait and say, I hope it doesn't come here. That you actually need to react early, and part of public health is that you try to intervene early, you prevent something happening, and then afterwards everyone complains to you that you overreacted and why did you do all that and waste that money. I think that's kind of the public health approach, is you prevent something from happening and then you just take the heat afterwards for saying that. And I think this is definitely true. And for example, Imperial's projections, where I think, we were in a worst case scenario, a lot of that's been averted through the measures that were taking place, not only kind of the lockdown measures, but the way people themselves changed their behavior, the way that, in the end, testing and tracing did get going, and the way that we did see communities come together. And then you could look back, and we are seeing this in countries like Norway and Denmark, where people say, it wasn't that bad. And, why do people complain about it? But it wasn't that bad because they reacted, because there were those measures put in place. And I think that's a difficulty for the next pandemic. It's that, how do you get people to react early and to see where this could all head if you don't intervene? Because, as Dr. Soumyanathan said, we react to crisis, we react reactively. And so how do you actually get out of that psychological chain? I think this will affect how people look at infections. I think the next time you hear about, plague in Madagascar or yellow fever in Brazil or a new infection that no one knows what is, often, let's say West Africa. I don't think people are going to sit around. I think, the general public will be very interested to learn about that, where in the past, this was kind of a very niche topic among people who are working in global health or in infectious diseases.
And I'd add one further thing to that.
I'll also give you a question. Maybe this question is for part of your answer. What have you learned? I mean, obviously you are, look at models very closely, design models, etc. How have they performed, and how models can only improve with time and with evidence? How useful have the models proved to be, and how better will they become as a result of this?
Yes, it's interesting. People kind of identify the work we do with models. I actually think the things which have made the biggest difference in terms of policy in this pandemic has been our early assessment of the scale of the pandemic in Wuhan. Back at the time where China was reporting only 20 cases, we estimated there were thousands. And then our estimate of the overall severity of this virus in terms of the proportion of people infected who die. I mean, those are the two things which probably had the largest impact. And then assessing transmissibility. So models are useful for evaluating what are called counterfactual scenarios. I mean, Devi just referred to it. So what would happen if you did X or if you did Y? And in this case, because we have locked down, we have a counterfactual of doing nothing or limited measures. And we concluded from the models quite early that that would lead to unacceptable levels of mortality and healthcare demand. And so the world has responded accordingly. I think it's also very important to say, before we talk about the threat of the next pandemic, is less than 10% of the world's population has been infected by this virus. We are still at a very early stage. Yes, it's not a crisis as yet. It's not a crisis right now in the same way as it was back in February and March. But it is a crisis in terms of society, the economy, and health, how we maintain control of this virus globally. In a way which allows society to get somewhere closer to normal and allows people to continue to have a livelihood going forward. And that's a much bigger issue in resource-poor countries, I should say, than rich countries.
So we're running short of time, but that does sort of lead me very neatly to my final question, which is probably the hardest question that I'll ask of all of you in this session. So we've talked a lot about the next pandemic, but I think I would be remiss if I didn't ask you all where you see things going over the next 18 to 24 months in this crisis. So I know it's impossible to predict, but I mean, I would ask for your best guess in terms of how things play out between, say, now and the middle of 2022. Dr. Swaminathan, maybe you can start us on that. How do you see things playing out over the next 2 years?
Yes. So as you say, it's hard to predict because it depends on a number of things. It depends on the biology of the virus, and viruses mutate. And so it could mutate and become more virulent, more transmissible. It could mutate and become less so. And this is something we cannot predict. It's also true that more people will be developing immunity as this virus, really rages across the world. But we also know that to develop herd immunity, you need a significant proportion of the population, over 50%, to have immunity in the form of either humoral or cell-mediated immunity. And there are unknowns there as well. The other big aspect, of course, is what we do, what governments do, what people do, how much behavior change can we sustain. I think that's going to be one of the critical elements. We see now in many countries, there's universal masking. People are maintaining a discipline about distancing and respiratory and hand hygiene. But in many other countries, it's not the case. And in fact, I think the WHO Director General put a call out to young people around the world a couple of days ago, asking them for more restraint because they, of late, have been the ones who are driving this epidemic in many countries. So it depends a lot on how effective our public health responses are, and especially as countries open up, what happens. But what I can say is that we know this virus is not going away anytime soon. It's established itself, and it's going to keep on transmitting wherever it gets an opportunity to do so. It's there in practically every country in the world. Some have managed to keep it at a very low level, through very stringent actions, and some have not been able to control it at all, and then there are shades in between. So we know we have to live with this. We have to make sure that other health, essential health services, start functioning again. There's been a huge dent on those essential health services. We know that, I think, a year down the line, when we look back and look at the impact it had on diseases like tuberculosis, HIV, malaria, cancer, or immunizations, we will see that this year we've had huge setbacks in all of these diseases. And so that's going to be important, which means, again, bringing investment, bringing in more health workers, bringing in more public health staff. All of that needs to be done very quickly. As we wait for vaccines, hopefully we'll have a few effective and safe vaccines. They then have to be scaled, they have to be manufactured in the billions of doses. Most of the vaccines we're looking at need at least 2 doses. So we're looking at the latter half of 2021, 2022 to really begin to scale vaccination programs around the world in order to get enough protection to block transmission. So we're looking at probably a 2-year window where we will need to continue to be on high alert and managing this virus, as well as trying to have the economic life, try to get it back to some semblance of normality. But I would end by saying that I think the behavior of people probably is going to be the most important factor, other than, of course, the action taken by governments. Over.
Thank you very much. Professor Sridhar, do you want to take that up? I mean, not only how do you see things panning out over the next 18 months to 2 years, but how do you see the public engagement, public acceptance, and some of the restrictions on our freedom, necessary restrictions on our freedom, playing out as well in tandem with that?
Oh, I think as time goes on, we're going to see fatigue setting in, people getting tired of these restrictions, and especially people who feel like they're unaffected, wanting to get on with their lives. I mean, the things infectious disease outbreak show is how we're all tied together. You can have 95% of people comply, but the 5% who don't can set everything back for that 95%. What you do affects me, what I do infect you, and that's classic infectious diseases. In terms of how it pans out, I would agree with many of those comments. I kind of would put forward 3 best case situations and then possibly a worst case. And the best case would be the virus mutates into a form that's perhaps more infectious, but less deadly, has less side effects, more innocuous, so more like one of the common cold coronaviruses. That would be tremendous if that happened, because that would mean that we wouldn't have the health impacts that the SARS-CoV-2 seems to give. The second would be that there's broader immunity, T-cell immunity than we think. The antibody surveys have been remarkably disappointing, that most countries are coming in under 10%. If there was a better kind of test to say that actually could more people than we think be exposed or have cross immunity from other viruses, that would be great as well. But again, both of those are uncertain. And the third would be if there's a vaccine, there's several promising ones that come through in the next few months. And then you'd have something to really convince, the public to comply, say, hold on with these measures, comply with these measures for a bit longer, because there's a vaccine coming, and that could be a game changer, especially if it has very few side effects and is ineffective in terms of lasting immunity for a year or two. But I also think we can't guarantee any of those. And we're going into a winter. This virus seems to like cold, indoor conditions, damp conditions. And I think then all countries can do is try to control super spreading events, go after clusters, and just kind of keep trying to drive the virus out so you can keep your economy going and society going and get schools open. I think in the 2-year time work, let's say we get to the spring and we've had a really bad winter, a lot of people have died, we've gotten into another lockdown, you might see countries that can starting to eliminate this virus, similar to what New Zealand, Taiwan, Vietnam, Thailand have done, and just said, actually, we don't want to live with it. We'll put in place COVID checks on our borders. We'll put in place testing and quarantine procedures so we can catch the virus, so we can get, and what you might see in a very kind of surreal take is that you have a COVID-free world. The countries that can clear it and can have border checks and robust testing will have it. And the countries that can't, probably generally low resource countries, are going to struggle, and then hopefully can come and help. And that would be, for example, if you don't have lasting immunity, which we don't know yet, and that you could have repeated waves of this virus rather than any kind of static position. So I think there's a whole range of scenarios, and I think I just try to kind of lay them out of what are the uncertainties, the scenarios, and as we get more information, we can start to narrow the number of scenarios that are out there from best case to worst case.
Interesting. Professor Ferguson, I'll give you the final word.
Mixed picture now globally, which will continue. And I mean, this is commented on before. I would say the majority of countries are basically controlling spread to a limited degree, but not sufficient to actually stop their case numbers rising. And I think we'll see in a majority of countries, if not the majority of the world's population, ongoing transmission at quite high levels, at least for the rest of this year. And I would include the United States in that. I think in a much smaller number of countries, but including China, including much of Southeast Asia and much of Europe, you will see continued efforts to suppress transmission, which will come at a cost, a significant ongoing economic and social cost. But I am moderately optimistic that we won't see in those settings very large increase in case numbers, or at least not going up to the levels we saw back in March. I completely agree. I mean, vaccine would be a game changer. I suspect, given the number of candidates under development, we will have some promising news by the end of the year of at least one or more candidates which show efficacy in people in clinical trials. But the scale up of vaccination is going to take considerable time. So whilst a few countries may be lucky and have vaccine by, for instance, early in next spring or summer, much of the world will have to wait longer.
To leave it there, unfortunately, we could talk about this all day as we're out of time. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for joining us today. We're extremely grateful for your time, and I know you're all extremely busy. Thank you to our audience, both within and outside the Bloomberg community. Thank you for joining us. And you can follow the conversation at Bloomberg Live on Twitter, or you can like us on Facebook. And to learn more about upcoming events, please visit our website at bloomberglive.com. Thank you all and stay well.
Special thanks to our sponsor, Pharma, for making this Bloomberg Prognosis virtual briefing possible.